Hi, this is Daniela Cambone. Welcome back to the Daniela Cambone Show here on ITM Trading. Well, my guest today says the Fed made a huge mistake, cutting 50 basis points. So now what does he think? That even more Fed officials are coming out saying more is needed, more cuts, more aggressively. George Gammon, the man behind the Rebel Capitalist Show, welcome back. So good to see you, my friend.
Oh, thanks for having me back. It's always fun to talk.
Yeah, well, let's talk about what you call a very big mistake made by Powell and company. Tell me why, and then I'll get to the second part. Tell me why.
Well, first of all, I think the big mistake they made is they didn't cut more. It's not that they cut too much. They didn't cut enough. And just very simple. If you look at the 2-year Treasury yield, Gunlock always points this out, that the Fed just follows the 2-year. And if you look at the delta between the 2-year and Fed funds, where it was prior to the 50 basis point cut, you see that it was pretty much at an all-time extreme going back to the GFC. So what this is the market telling us how far off sides it thinks the Fed is. The Fed likes to use the term the neutral rate or the terminal rate or R star or something like that to determine, where the Goldilocks interest rate should be for Fed funds. And but that's just simple. Just look at the 2-year Treasury. And if you go back and look at history, what happens is when the Fed tries to catch up with the 2-year Treasury, what ends up happening is the 2-year Treasury doesn't flatten out or it doesn't start to go back up. It goes down even further. So as an example, let's say you've got the Fed funds at 5.25% and you've got the 2-year Treasury trading at, let's just say it's trading at 3.5. And then let's just say that the Fed cuts all the way down to 3.5. At that point, you never see the 2-year Treasury just flatten out and say, okay, the Fed is done. All the cuts already baked in. They've done their job. We're in this Goldilocks economy. Now the 2-year Treasury just goes forward at maybe 3.5, 3.55, 3.6, something like that. That's not what happens, Daniela. They cut down to 3.5, or they're getting close to that mark, and then the 2-year Treasury just keeps going down further and further and further and further. So the Fed, if you look at these interest rate hiking cycles, which obviously we have to get to the rate cuts, you see that they never go in kind of this gradual fashion. Like if you look at the dot plots or you look at their projections for where interest rates, the Fed funds, is going to be in, let's say, the end of the year or maybe the end of next year, it's always this nice, slow decline. But then when you look at reality and you compare that with history, you see that they never drop rates in just a slow fashion. It's always like wet and wild. It's always like one of those water slides where you just start here, just boo, it's like a Wile E. Coyote thing. And the only time that I can see going back to, call it the 1980s or so, where they had a rate hiking cycle where they didn't cut dramatically was back in the mid 1990s. This was 1995, 1996. But during that time, you didn't have an inverted curve and you didn't have the unemployment rate spiking, which we can see just using the SOM rule as a broad proxy. So anytime that you have those factors, those huge, those very powerful economic indicators, especially when they're lined up, when you have unemployment spiking and you have not only an inversion, but an uninversion due to a bull steepener, which means the front end of the curve is coming down faster than the long end of the curve, you always, and that's preceded by a Fed rate hiking cycle, you always see a decline in Fed funds at a very, again, the wet and wild scenario. So that's why I said the Fed probably made a mistake, but it wasn't that they cut 50 instead of 25. It's that they didn't cut by 75.
So are you happy to hear that, we're speaking ahead of a lot of other Fed officials who are slated to speak, but I mean, just the ones that spoke earlier today, Chicago Fed chief, Atlanta Fed chief, echoing that the Fed will have to move more aggressively here and with more rate cuts ahead. Is this the right path?
Well, it depends
you
on
say
what.
Yes.
Well, it depends on what your objectives are. So if your objective is to soften the blow, let's say, of a recession, then yeah, that's the right path. I'm not going to say that they're going to avoid a recession because they've never, ever, ever, ever been able to stop a recession through these rate cuts when we have all these other economic factors or indicators that are lined up. So they're always responding to a recession. They're never preventing a recession. But like I said, it doesn't mean that they can't soften the blow to a certain degree. They make it better than it otherwise would be, but that doesn't mean that it's still not a hard landing or it's still not devastating. I mean, look at the GFC as a
Right.
perfect example. You could say that, yes, it would have been worse. Maybe it would have been, but it was still pretty darn bad, even though they cut rates.
Well, I was going to say, because Powell, would be the, Mount Rushmore of central bankers if he is able to orchestrate the soft landing. But, based on what you're saying, you don't think he's going to get it.
Well, they never have. So you just have to ask the question, why have they never orchestrated a soft landing in the past? It's because they're always behind the curve. That's why they always follow the 2-year. And so if this time isn't different, which I don't know why it would be, then they need to follow the 2-year down even more because we're headed for a hard landing that they can't really prevent. But they might be able to make the recession a little better than it otherwise would have been.
You did a great video, and I urge everyone to check it out on your YouTube channel, where you go into detail about the Fed's decision here. And you bring up a very key point about the narrative that the Fed wants us to believe. So
Yeah.
if we can go a little bit more in depth here about what do they want us to be thinking right now?
They want you to think that they control the economy. They want you to think that lower interest rates means that they're providing liquidity, or that lower interest rates, excuse me, mean that they're quote unquote stimulating the economy. And therefore, if they just lower these interest rates, then all of a sudden we're going to see the unemployment rate flatten out and then go back down to 3.7 or 3.4. And they do that while at the same time, the inflation rate as measured by the CPI goes down to, let's say, 2.2, 2.1, 2%, something like that. And then we're off to the races. And it's why? Because the Fed just dialed it in perfectly. It's like this thermostat on the wall, and it's 69 degrees, a little too cold, 71 degrees, a little too hot. So we're just going to dial it right into 70 degrees. And then the economy is going to respond. People are going to take out more debt because now interest rates are lower. This is going to increase aggregate demand. And because aggregate demand goes up, that's what prevents us from going into the recession. And that's how they orchestrate the no landing, soft landing. This is the narrative, and this is what they want you to believe, but it never, ever, ever, ever works out that way.
You also say, if you look underneath the hood at the reality of it all, let's talk about the reality, not the narrative they want us to believe, you see the economic storm clouds brewing. Is the labor market leading that pack for you of the brewing problems?
Yeah, I mean, you just look at the SOM roll. It's a simple proxy, and all that is just a 3-month moving average of the unemployment rate relative to, I believe it's also a 3-month moving average of the low in the unemployment rate over the past 12 months. And I mean, take that back to the 1950s, and it's pretty much 100% accurate. And so the Claudia Song comes out now. I don't know why she's doing this, maybe because she's a Democrat or something like that. And she's saying that, oh, well, just ignore the SOM rule, even though it's been right every single time because of immigration. So they've got X amount of people that are unemployed. And therefore, if you increase the denominator, then, well, that doesn't mean that, the demand side is weak. That just means that the supply side is the reason why the unemployment rate is going up. Well, this is a completely bogus answer because, number one, they calculate the unemployment rate using census data from 2022 before you had this huge spike in immigration. So although it may impact the rate of inflation, it wouldn't impact the rate of change. you see, and the rate of change is what the Somme rule is obviously all about. And then also, if you want to argue that, you'd have to say that the 1970s should have also debunked the Somme rule because we had the labor force participation increasing because of women coming into the workforce. So why on earth was it just as accurate in the 1970s as it was in the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s? So that's the one main thing that's staring in the face, but also interest rates. I mean, look, if the U.S. economy was running on all 8 cylinders, you wouldn't see the 10-year Treasury trading at, I don't know where it is now, but call it 125 basis points plus under the Fed funds rate. I mean, that's not a sign of a healthy economy. It's crazy that you actually have to point that out. You say, hey, this is kind of unusual. This is very unnatural. What that is, it's the bond market telling you that future growth and inflation expectations are lower than where they are right now. And that you should, and why is that? Because the banks are just taking that balance sheet capacity and a lot of the financial institutions, and instead of lending that money out to the real economy, they see that as too risky. So instead, they just buy treasuries. And they buy treasuries because that's quote unquote risk free. And that's where you've got the most liquidity. So whenever the market is risk off, they're going to go into the safest, most liquid asset. And globally, whether we like it or not, that is the U.S. Treasury, and more specifically, the long end of the curve. And so that's why you see the yield curve invert, because it's the players in the global economy that have, I call it information asymmetry, Daniela. These players in the Treasury market that really move it one way or the other, they have a lot more information than you and I will ever have.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, I would argue they have way more information than the Fed will ever have, because they're the ones that are talking to these global banks in the Eurodollar system. They're the ones that are talking to these multinational corporations that are doing business, that are doing the borrowing. And so they get this intel first and foremost. And that's what prompts them to do X, Y, and Z with their balance sheet, or A, B, and C. Whether it's, okay, I'm hearing from all these multinational corporations that business is great, business is booming, and therefore, yeah, I'm going to keep lending because I'm going to try to go for that higher reward. I'm going to go for that higher yield because the risk reward makes sense. But if you're hearing the complete opposite, then you're like, no way am I going to lend out into this environment because I'm worried about being paid back. And even though I might be able to get a little higher interest rate, the risk reward doesn't make sense when I could just sit here in 10-year treasuries and collect 3.5%. And they're doing this, Daniela, while the Fed increases interest rates at the front end of the curve. And that's what inverts it. And that's why in my view, the yield curve is such a powerful predictor, and that's why it has almost a 100% accuracy rate. It's because it's functioning, the underlying fundamentals or the underlying actions by the market participants that drive the yield curve is, in my view, based on insider information. And insider information is a great way to trade. Just ask Nancy Pelosi, right?
Ouch. Oh, let me ask you this, George, because I don't know if you caught the press conference at the end of Powell's, speech.
Yeah.
What, if you were in the room, what is the one question you would have asked Powell or challenged him on?
What's the one question I would have asked him? How on earth can you sit there with a straight face and say the economy is doing fine and the consumer is resilient and the economy is running on all 8 cylinders? If the economy is doing so great, why the hell did you just cut by 50 basis points? I mean, let's remember that the last time they cut by 50 basis points was the GFC. And the time before that, it was the dot-com bust. So I don't get it. He's completely contradicting himself by saying that the economy is doing fine, but yet we're going to have to cut by 50. If the economy was doing fine, you wouldn't have to cut by anything, let alone 50 basis points. And then I'd ask him about the 2-year treasury. And I would say, are you guys just following the 2-year? And are you concerned that you're just cutting 50 basis points when you look at what the interest rate markets are actually telling you. And then I'd point at their own tools that they've said in the past they pay most attention to, which is something called a near-term forward spread. And the near-term forward spread is screaming recession just as much, if not more, than the inversion in the Treasury curve.
We're going to talk the election, but were you surprised that the Trump campaign didn't seize the moment and jump on that and highlight the fact that the economy is in dire straits?
I don't know. They're both idiots, Danielle. I try not. I try to pay as little attention
Oh,
to Trump and Harris. They're both just economic knuckle draggers. I mean, they have absolutely no idea. You got one person that's just pure evil, and obviously that's Kamala Harris. And then you've got another guy that's just a complete megalomaniac that has no principles. You know, he has no kind of moral North Star that guides his decision-making process. It's just completely all over the place, right? Now, if I had to choose between the two, obviously I'd go with Trump because the number one concern for me, or I think the number one concern for Americans in general, or maybe the entire developed West, is freedom of speech.
mm-hmm.
So if you're going to be a one topic voter, I think that topic should definitely be censorship. And you've got to go with the party that is going to censor free speech the least. And that's obviously Trump. So, you know, I don't like him, but he's a hell of a lot better than Harris. But the bottom line is I can't stand listening to either of them.
Well, you know, November is going to be one heck of a month, George, with the election and then the next FOMC. So what I'm hearing from you, you're expecting the Fed to do, we can expect more cuts in November, basically.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if the way this typically plays out is, and again, I want to make it very, very clear. There are no certainties, there are only probabilities. And when you look at these economic indicators, you can't use them to sit there and time specifically when you're going to go into a recession. What we have to do is say, how have these cycles played out in the past? So if you look, you see, okay, the first thing that happens is the curve inverts. The next thing that happens is the curve starts to steepen out due to a bull steepener, which is the front end going down faster than the long end. The next thing that happens is the unemployment rate spikes. The next thing that happens is you have an uninversion that's sustained, right? The next thing that happens is the Fed drops rates, which which steepens out the curve, and then the stuff hits the fan, and then a year later you have the NBER come out and say, oh yeah, by the way, this whole past 12 months when we were telling you that the economy was strong and resilient, yeah, go ahead and disregard that. We lied. It was actually in a recession. You know, that's exactly what they did in 2008, where they announced in December of 2008 that we had been in a recession since January. You know, it's like, oh, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. And this is the way these things play out. So what we have to do, Danielle, is just go through our checklist, and then we can determine the
Right.
probabilities of it playing out the same way. So check number one is
Right.
inversion of the curve. We got that.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
next we got the bull steepener. Boom, check
Right.
that one off the list. The next one is the unemployment rate spiking. We got that one off the list. The next one is the uninversion of the curve that's sustained. We got that one off the list because now the 2-year is trading under the 10-year. The next thing is we got the Fed dropping rates. Boom, check that off the list. So the only other thing there is the recession and the NBER. Now, it is true, we may have a no landing. We may have a soft landing or something like that. But the bottom line is so far, this cycle has played out the exact same way that every single cycle has played out, going all the way back to the 1950s, when you have an inversion of the curve and you have all these other, you know, the Somme rule and the spike. This is the way it always plays out. So I don't know why it would. Now, you could say it's on 100% probability, but the probability is extremely high, and that's really how you want to position your portfolio.
Okay. Okay. So let's take it one step further. If we can forecast and figure out this is the probability of how it's going to work out, how should we be positioning our portfolio? Who wins, who loses in these scenarios?
Well, me personally, I've got bets on the long end of the curve. Now, I would prefer to bet on the 2-year. I wish I could do that, but there's really not a great vehicle that gives you some good bang for your buck on betting on the 2-year. You just buy the 2-year, but you're not going to get too many price moves, even if they drop rates, or even if the interest rate on the 2-year goes down substantially. So, calls on the TLT is something that's interesting if you can get some liquidity. Gold is interesting if we don't have a liquidity event. And obviously, I love the chart on gold. I mean, you can't. The chart on gold is just absolutely fantastic. So the only issue with gold I have is if you go back and look at recessions where we have a liquidity crunch, the first thing people usually sell is gold because it's doing its job. Gold is insurance, and gold doesn't have counterparty risk, and you're always going to get a bid. So when we go into like a GFC type Lehman event, you're going to see gold sell off because that's the only thing that people can actually sell. And again, it's because gold is doing its job. And so, but if you look at a recession where we don't have a liquidity event, then gold, there's no reason for gold to sell off. And usually that's just what the central planners do to try to get through the recession is a huge, huge, huge tailwind, typically for the price. So for me, I'm very comfortable just holding 10% of my portfolio in gold, just as an insurance policy. But that's all I do. And then just, sit back and look at the chart and see how these things play out. But I would be very hesitant with the stock market right now for obvious reasons, because it's completely overvalued. And if you're going into a recession, you really don't want to bet on the stock market. A lot of people think that if the Fed drops rates, then that means the S&P 500 will go up. But if you look at the past Fed rate cuts, you see that that's only applicable if you don't go into a recession. So if you've got all of these things lined up, like we talked about earlier in the discussion, then the odds are that once the Fed drops rates, that's actually negative for the S&P 500 over the next 6 months. But on that note, it depends. If we get a liquidity event, Daniela, I don't put it past them to buy stocks. I mean, the Bank of Japan did it, so why on earth wouldn't the Fed? And they understand just as much as we do that the entire economy is just built or propped up by asset prices. I mean, right now we're in a depression. We are in an economic depression when you look at the poor and the middle class. There is no difference between the lot of the poor and middle class right now in the United States in 2024 than in the 1930s. The only thing that would add to, the only reason why we're not at negative GDP is just because you've got the top 20% of people who own assets, and they're getting rich, and they're the ones that are out there buying the Ferraris and popping bottles of champagne and going to all the restaurants and doing all the shopping on Amazon. The poor and middle class are struggling, to say the least. And that's a wild understatement. So you have this massive bifurcation in the economy, and the Fed knows that. So my point is, if the Fed's going to try to respond to a recession, they're going to do it by trying to prop up asset prices, because that's the only thing they have.
You make me think of another question here, George, of the line between the poor and the middle class. I mean, what's the number where middle class starts? A family that makes how much per year, George?
Well, I would say, just broadly speaking, I think anyone in the United States right now that's making under $100,000 a year is saying, what booming economy? All I see is recession. And then anyone making over, let's just say, $150,000 a year that has assets, they're Scrooge McDuck. They're swimming around in their in their safe full of gold coins and whatnot, and just saying, what on earth are these fools talking about? We're not even close to a recession. This is the greatest economy that I've ever seen in my life. And so this is the contrast. So you just have to ask yourself, what is making that happen? And it goes right back to asset prices. So you got to think about what the U.S. economy would look like if you had asset prices go down by 50%, like we saw in 2008 I'm talking about the S&P, and I'm talking about the housing market from 2006 to 2012. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying go through that thought experiment and what would happen. So that crippled the U.S. economy in 2008, 2009, 2010. But I would argue that the economy was far less dependent on asset prices back then than it is now, as far
I
as
would think
aggregate
so.
demand. I mean, where's the aggregate, all this aggregate demand that you're seeing? You know, we're past the whole stimmies, we're past the PPP, we're past the point where a lot of people don't have to pay their mortgage or pay their rent. So where is all this aggregate demand coming from, right? And the answer is the stock market. The answer is housing prices. This is all just paper wealth. This is not the fact that we're
Mm-hmm.
producing more goods and services. And this is
Mm-hmm.
complete nonsense. It's just paper wealth and that paper wealth can evaporate very, very quickly.
You know, well, as you were speaking about gold, it made me think of the headline, and I'm sure you saw billionaire John Paulson saying he'd be looking to pull out of stocks completely and go all in cash and gold. You know, this would be amplified scenario should there be a Harris win. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's being political too. I don't think it. I mean, again, as for the stock market, is it going to crash if Harris gets elected and if Donald Trump gets elected? Is it going to skyrocket? I doubt it. I mean, it is true that if she pulls one of these numbers, like a unrealized capital gains tax or
Mm.
something, or price controls, yeah, that's terrible for the markets. That's for sure. Can she get that through? I don't know. And are price controls any more insane than tariffs, the ones that Donald Trump is talking about? Or then he just came out the other day and he you know, he's supposed to be a free market guy and a champion of small government, and then he's saying how he wants to cap interest rates on credit cards at 10%. What? Look, as if he's Milton Friedman or something like that. I mean, come on, they're all terrible. They're all terrible. It's just which one is the least horrific, Daniela?
Okay. It's just, you know, just to wrap here, George, just bringing it home for the folks, because I have some people that emailed me and just feel like there's no end in sight right now. It just feels like, you know, no one's even talking about the debt, right? It's like, how do we get out of this, George?
Well, the
Right.
problem
And
with the,
I brought this up to, sorry, not to interrupt. I brought this up to Brian Lundy, and I know you're speaking at his conference.
yeah.
He has one of the best conferences out there. And I said, it's almost like you need someone drastic, like a Malay drastic, because or else how do we get out of this?
Well, look at how Argentina got out of it. You have to get to a point where you're just absolutely desperate,
Yeah.
and the United States is not at that point. So,
Okay.
you know, I mean, look at history. How have other societies gotten out of their malaise? It's because they have to hit rock bottom. They have to hit rock bottom. And I hope we don't have to do that in the United States, but I think the probability is very low. Now, the good news is we don't have to worry about a debt crisis. That's the good news. That's the least of people's concerns. You don't have to worry about the dollar crashing, and you don't have to worry about the treasury market going no bid. You don't have to worry about how
Why?
we're going to finance
Why?
deficits. Ask the 10-year treasury, Daniela. The 10-year treasury right now is trading less than it was in 2009 when the debt was 9 trillion. I'd like to remind your viewers that right now the debt is 35 trillion. 35
Yeah.
trillion. And the dollar, as measured by the DXY, is higher than it was in 2009, and the 10-year treasury is trading lower. So if we had a debt problem, if we had a problem financing the debt, because now all of a sudden the interest payments are over $1 trillion and blah, 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 the 10-year treasury would not, I repeat, would not be trading at 3.6. What moves the long end of the curve isn't really supply of treasuries. It seems very counterintuitive. But what it is it's really growth in inflation expectations. And this is why you can add $25 trillion of supply in treasuries over the last 15 years and interest rates go down. They don't go up. I mean, even compared to 2019, we're at 22 trillion in debt back then. So we added $13 trillion in debt just since the beginning of the cerveza sickness. And the 10-year treasury yield is 125 basis points under Fed funds. And so what happens here is wake me up when the 10-year treasury is trading at 8, 9, 10%. Until we get to that point, you've got nothing to worry about as far as handling the debt, because there's massive, massive demand out there. And don't take my word on it. Don't take my word. Forget George Gammon. Just look at the treasury market. They're telling you that demand is almost insatiable for these treasuries right now. So the problem with the debt, and I always argue this, I say, look, the real crisis is that there is not a debt crisis. I wish there was, because then we could pull back this spending and then we could get a Malay type situation. But unfortunately, the real problem with the debt in the United States is not servicing it. It's the economic distortions that are created by the government spending. You see, so we've to sit there and say that we've got this exorbitant privilege, I would say it's the exact opposite from a standpoint of this just allows us to continue to charge the credit card more and 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 more because of the dynamics of the global monetary system. The way the monetary system is set up outside the United States, where all these dollars are created in the Eurodollar system, I won't go into great detail, but it sets a bid for treasuries. That's why. If you go back and look at this explosion in debt, the explosion in deficits, you have to ask yourself, why have we not seen the rubber meet the road already? Why? Why are interest rates at 3.6 and not already at 10? You think the treasury market doesn't know about the unfunded liabilities? You think the treasury market doesn't know about the de-dollarization? You think they don't know about the BRICS currency? You think they don't know about Social Security payments and the Social Security fund going broke? Of course they do. Of course. Remember, there's information asymmetry, Daniela, meaning that we have the least amount of information. All of that is already priced in to the treasury curve, or excuse me, it's already priced in to the interest rates themselves. And what they're telling you is we want more. Why? Because this is really the underpinning, the collateral, the treasuries, is the underpinning for the global monetary system. And I don't like it. And also too, I'd remind you that as the global economy slows down, that means the demand for the collateral that underpins the global monetary system increases, right? And that just gives the United States the ability to spend more and more and more and more and more and more and more, which creates these economic distortions, which is why the poor and the middle class right now are suffering through a Great Depression. It's why when I go to Tucson, Arizona, I see a zombie apocalypse of drug-addicted homeless people walking around with heroin needles sticking out of their arm. That's why. It's because the government spending created that. The central planners and authoritarians that gave everyone this bullshit stimmy check and then locked everyone in a cage for 2 years and told them that they couldn't produce any goods and services because they were non-essential. That's why we've got the drug problem. That's why we've got the poor middle class in an economic depression. And unfortunately, there's nothing that stops it because there's this insatiable demand for treasuries because of the way the global monetary system is constructed to begin with.
You just you brought up a very, very valid points, and I'm sure someone's yelling at the screen saying, well, George, what would you label 35 trillion in debt then? If it's not a debt crisis, what is 35 trillion in debt?
It's 35 trillion in government spending, above and beyond taxes, for heaven's sakes. But I think a better way to look at it is the government spending as a percentage of GDP. That's your problem. That's your problem. So as the government spending as a percentage of GDP goes up and up and up, the economic efficiency goes down, 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 down. That's why central planning and communism doesn't work. Right? That's why those economies don't produce a lot of goods and services, right? Because they're centrally planned, meaning government spending is 100% of GDP. So right now we're about 50%. So as the
Right.
government spending goes higher and higher and higher, which it absolutely will. I'm not sitting here saying that the deficits are going to improve or that the U.S. debt is not going to explode. It absolutely is. In fact, I would probably argue that it's going to go a lot higher and it's going to get a lot worse than most people that claim the treasury market is going to blow up. I would say, as far as the deficits and the debt, I'd say it's going to go way higher. I would not be surprised if in the next 5 years the debt is well north of 50 trillion. Well, maybe even 3 years. Especially if we have a recession and the deficit to GDP goes up to, who knows, 15, 20%. But that doesn't mean that the price is going to be paid in the treasury market. That doesn't mean that we're going to have a hard time financing our debt or our deficits. It just means that we're going to have an additional amount of government spending that is going to continue and exacerbate the problem of misallocation of resources and malinvestment. So the bottom line is, look at what the economy has done since 2019. Look at what has happened as far as the bifurcation that we were just talking about. Look at what has happened to the poor and middle class getting squeezed. So my point is, you've got to expect that at an accelerated pace moving forward into the next 5 years, because we don't have a debt crisis. We have a government spending crisis.
Yeah.
And those two things are completely different. And I get so frustrated with all my friends that go to the New Orleans Investment Conference, because they sit there and they focus on the wrong thing. They sit there and focus on the long end of the curve blowing out. But forget that. Forget that. Don't waste any time on that. Look at the past 25 years. And if you can't tell me why we have not yet had a debt problem, then that means your models suck. That means your models are broken. And you've got to reevaluate your models, for heaven's sakes. And when you do reevaluate your models, you see exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, that's why there's such good debates at that show. Because you're going there and shout.
Everyone's on the exact same page. It's just me and Brent Johnson debating the other 45 speakers that are there.
Yeah, but you know what? You brought up you brought up a really, really good point when you were referring to the druggies and the homeless situation right now. Because I was having this conversation with my in-laws this weekend, who are true New Yorkers. I'm from Montreal. I've been living here 10 years, so I haven't seen all the cycles of the city. But they've lived through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the Giuliani decade, all that. And they were reflecting back on how bad New York was in the 80s and making comparisons to how bad it is today. When I asked them, they were saying it was bad, but you didn't see the homeless that you see today. And I said, well, how come? Where were they? Why didn't you see? Like, it was dangerous, yes, and there were issues, yes, but you didn't see the homelessness that you see today. Why is that so amplified? So I thank you for hitting on that.
Not only that, but look, back in 2019, you could go into Walmart and actually buy something. Now you can't. In Tucson, you can't even buy anything without getting some gal to come over and open up the cage for you. I went into Walmart, Danielle, when I was just there, and I was trying to buy fingernail clippers from China. These things were $2.18.
And that was locked. Yeah. And that was locked?
Yes, yeah. And I'd get some gal to come over and actually unlock this, because it's all behind like iron bars or whatever it is. So she has to unlock this just so I can get the little fingernail clippers. And not only that, this Walmart had been completely remodeled to the point where the section that's like a CVS, within Walmart, where they sell those things and like the hair care products and whatnot.
Yeah.
They had recreated it within the Walmart, so there was a kind of a funneling system, right, to where there was a bottleneck where they had a security guard. So the only way to get in and out of that section was through this bottleneck, where they had this security guard sitting there full time. And then within that section, within the
Right.
Walmart, they had the gal walking around. So if you wanted to get a bottle of shampoo or some,
Yeah.
$2 piece of metal from China, she could open up the thing for you, and then you could walk by the security guard so he could see that she actually opened it for you to know that you weren't stealing it, for heaven's sakes. And guess
Yeah.
what, Danielle? I live in Colombia, Medellin, Colombia. Everyone sits there and, oh, are you scared of being in a third world country, and all this complete nonsense? Well, you know what? When I go down to a CVS down here or my local drugstore, guess what I don't have to do? I don't have to get the gal to come over and open up the cage just so I can get a bottle of shampoo, because no one's stealing shit right here in a third world country. So that in and of itself, what does that tell you about what's happening to the overall economy in the United States? And we've got one thing to blame, and that's the central planners and the authoritarians creating these economic distortions.
Well, you just gave me goosebumps with that. Bringing it home for everyone watching, because I know people are going to be saying, "Okay, George, you just blew my mind with this segment. What am I supposed to be doing with this information now? What do we do with this
As far as your
information?"
portfolio, as far as the
Yeah, I
portfolio,
mean, I just want to say, as far as, yeah, like your portfolio, you mentioned, yeah, let's talk there. Let's just wrap it, bring it home, but also just in terms of life. Are we still smiling?
you're smiling, but I would get the hell out of an urban area. That's for sure. I wouldn't be within, well, I shouldn't say that. I would be at least probably 10 to 20 miles away from an urban area. That's number one. And then I would start looking into Plan B stuff. Our good friend Doug Casey talks about that all the time, so I'm sure your viewers are familiar. But then, as far as my portfolio, I mean, obviously, you have to own gold at all times. I mean, that's just a no-brainer. But you especially have to own gold in these times. It's not because of hyperinflation or anything like that. I would like to remind your viewers that we have never in the United States gone through a recession where you had unemployment rate spike and you did not see the inflation rate go down. Never, not once, not even once. I just did a video on this about a half an hour ago. So people like to reference back to the 1970s and say, oh my gosh, we had this inflationary recession. No, we didn't. No, we didn't. In the
Well,
74-75 recession in 1980, when you saw the unemployment rate spike at the end of this recession or in the middle of it, you saw the inflation rate go down, not up, not up. So my point is, you own gold right now because, as far as I can tell, gold really doesn't always respond to inflation. It doesn't always respond to geopolitical risk. In my view, what it usually responds to is counterparty risk and faith or lack thereof in the system. And based on everything that I'm seeing right now, I personally have a lot less faith in the system. And I think that's the main reason why gold is catching a bid. And if you're a long-term investor, sure, you could see a dip if we get this liquidity. So I'd be very, very careful there. I want to be clear. But if you're a long-term investor, or not even an investor, if you're just someone that's trying to protect your purchasing power, for heaven's sakes, you've got to have a certain portion of your portfolio in gold. But then, like I said, I like liquidity. I like the T-bills. I like rolling those. I like, if you want to get cute, you could play the long end of the curve. But then I want to start setting up a watch list, just like I had, thank goodness, going into the cerveza sickness, because March of 2020, when everything went on sale. And that's when you
yeah.
want to be buying. And that's the hardest time. So if it is true that this time is not different, then what that leads us to believe is that over the next 6 months or a year, we could see the S&P 500 go down maybe 15, 20%. And that could lead to some very, very, very interesting buying opportunities for those people that are prepared. And then when the central planners come back out and muck up everything else once again by doing stimulus or UBI or who knows what the hell they're going to do to try to get us out of this recession, that's when you can ride the next wave up, because the one thing we know definitively is they cannot afford to have a sustained, or I should say a dramatic decrease in the level of asset prices. It's terrible. It's great for those who own assets, but it's terrible for the United States and society at large.
There you have it, folks. George Gammon on a silver platter, gold platter. I love the energy. I love the content. Rebel Capitalist is the show. George does tremendous work. Check him out. We adore you, George. Thank you for coming back on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
We'll see you soon, and we'll see all of you soon here again on the Daniela Cambone Show here on ITM Trading. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and to sign up at danielacambone.com so you stay on top of it all. That's it for me. Thanks for watching.